but is fundamental and important. Again, it's part of my attempt to not necessarily justify, but rather to legitimize why I talk about it as histories of planning as opposed to history of planning or a history of planning. The main question that I think we ought to be thinking about as planners is, in a sense, is planning colonial? Isn't planning as a simple act by the way, I still have this echo. Can we reduce the echo a bit in the back? Yes, because I think it came from, we adjusted it for the video. Isn't planning the invasion of nature? So if planning is the invasion of nature, then it is colonial in essence. While colonialism was brutal and exploitative as a process, one that in a sense subjugated one set of people or one government, if you will, to another, what I'm trying to focus on here is not on the militaristic aspect of colonialism, but rather on its developmental aspects. The case that I'm making is a very simple one, is that colonial regimes engaged in massive planning, and planning often that changed the fate of countries or cities or places around the world. I'm going to even argue that development planning as we know it is not only a post-World War II project, as I explained in my second lecture, but that it is also an idea that has been forged, if you will, in the context of 19th century colonialism, particularly European colonialism of the countries and regions that we now refer to as the Global South, the Third World. And that its roots, the roots of planning, of modern planning, actually lie in colonial occupations and the mission to so-called civilize the occupants of many of these countries. So let me start. Around the middle of the 19th century, the world witnessed the rise of modern industrial capitalism and the emergence of organized political dominance that was represented by colonialism and imperialism. Under the colonial paradigm, the world, as Anthony King has actually written, was divided into two kinds of people and two types of societies. Powerful, administratively advanced, racially Caucasoid, nominally Christian, mainly European, mainly white dominant nations, and powerless, organizationally backward, traditionally rooted, dominated societies. In short, in the early communication and exchange between cultures, the world was divided into colonizers and natives, with both parties recognizing and even acknowledging their distinction. As Stuart Hall, however, has observed, he's one of my favorite writers, an urban sociologist in the Birmingham School, that if you look at each of these terms, which offer duality, whether it is the West, and I've expanded this terminology substantially in one of my books called Tradition, the West, the North, the core, you will discover that all of these terms are mainly defined by difference and constructed in opposition to the other. None of these terms constitute, if you will, a monolithic pre-existing a real subject in and of itself. In fact, similarly, the subordinate term, the South, the periphery, the Third World, are equal inventions that have been produced in a variety of colonial and post-colonial and anti-colonial discourses. Perhaps no one ever articulated this concept of otherness and its effect, if you will, as well as Edward Said, an author that many of you who are really interested beyond planning must have been exposed to. His work on Orientalism demonstrated the power of the word and the crucial role in inventing, maintaining, and producing a constructed image of the other. According to Said's Orientalism, and that's the cover of the book, and then I'm actually showing this very specific drawing that was made by John Leo Jerome, one of the painters that I told you about earlier. Orientalism is a style of thought based upon an ontological and an epistemological distinction made between the Orient and the Occident. The concept was invented by European administrators and scholars in the late 18th century following the Enlightenment. During the colonial period, Orientalism was a systematic discourse through which European powers were able to manage, produce, and reproduce the idea of the Orient. This painting is actually called the Snake Charmer, and it's a very interesting painting because it is supposedly a painting that has occurred or that depicts a scene in the Blue Mosque in Cairo of a nude boy who to the tunes of a flute player. A scene that could never have ever occurred in a mosque, despite the fact that the setting is absolutely real physically, but the activity itself is not necessarily one that either existed in Egypt or could have occurred in a mosque. In fact, we know that Jerome also visited other parts of the world, so it seems that he has also literally imported his Indian flute player into an Egyptian scene. And has taken the snake charmer approach, which again exists in parts of the Indian subcontinent, and put it in the context of Egypt of the 19th century, a practice that was not common in Egypt at the time. But all was okay, and all could have gone by without ever being questioned, because these were artistic expressions that sold thousands of copies to the elite in Europe at that time. That was before the era of television, it was before the era of photography. So in studying the relationship between colonialism and planning and its effect on the production of the built environment, I think that there are two historic phases that can be discerned: the colonial period and the era of independent and nation building. And that's what's really important to us, even here in the context of India. These phases seem to have been accompanied by two respective urban forms: the hybrid and the modern, or even sometimes the pseudo-modern, if you will. The change created a relationship of unequal cultural and socioeconomic exchange. And if one analyzes the issues of identity in the cities of the global south today, or the third world, no matter what you call it, one still must consider that this transformation must be understood in terms of the processes by which this identity was violated, ignored, distorted, or even stereotyped. Jerome's reception of the Siamese ambassador, again, this is another painting that comes from that time by the same painter, is a very good example of that. Because in a sense, these artistic expressions often showed how is it that third worlders were willing to be completely subjugated, if you will, by European colonizers. This very specific painting is very indicative of precisely that, because Siam, the country that is now Thailand, was actually partly invaded by France in the 1850s, and only invaded because France wanted to have an outlet for the production of its own products, for the sale of its own products. And as a result of changing ambassadors, the Siamese envoys went to Paris, went to Versailles in this case, and were kneeling down, if you will, to the representative of Western imperial might, the Queen of France, in this very prostrating gesture. And of course, they couldn't even look at the Queen, and they had to go backward in a way that made the French feel we have subjugated those people to that extent. The irony is, of course, is that in today Thailand, the subjects of the Thai king would behave exactly in the same way. But this was not necessarily understood by the French, and it's precisely in these kinds of misunderstandings that precisely the gulf between the dominant and the dominated was exaggerated. I think in studying the built environment produced under conditions of colonial dominance, it is important to differentiate between colonialism and imperialism, specifically as Edward Said tried to do in one of his books, Imperialism and Culture. Said provided a useful distinction between the two terms. He defined imperialism as the practice, theory, and attitudes of establishing a dominant metropolitan center with which to rule a distinct territory. Within this paradigm, colonialism, by definition, is a specific articulation of imperialism associated, in this case, with the territorial invasion and settlement policies. There is then an implied chronology ordering in the terms colonialism and imperialism, which I take for granted in this particular lecture. And in a sense, I think that a lot of these terms are very important for us in the context of planning. What makes a particular relationship colonial? Anthony King's approach has been very useful, I would argue. He identified three main characteristics of societies inhabiting such cities. First, that power, economic, political, social, is principally in the hands of a non-indigenous minority. Second, that this minority is superior in terms of military, technological, and economic resources, and as a result, of course, in terms of its social organization. And third, that the colonized majority, in this case, are usually racially or ethnically, culturally, or religiously different from the colonizers. If you reflect on all forms of colonization or colonialism that you may have encountered or that you may have studied even as undergraduate students, you discover that that's exactly what it always was about. Others have distinguished a series of phases by which this process of colonization typically proceeds. First, there's the reconnaissance of terrain, gathering of coastal resources, bartering with local populations, plundering and initial military action within the interior, securing the outposts, and then imperial imposition and the implementation of a first group of non-military settlers. This is exactly how the United States was established. Until the imposition of non-military settlers, everything that I talked about is also exactly what the British did in a case like India. Others have also talked about the notion of the colony itself. What does a colony really mean? And you can imagine, of course, that the term colony, which does exist in Indian parlance today, to often refer to specific residential communities, also has a planning impetus in it. Jürgen Osterhammel, who has written extensively also about colonialism, identifies key characteristics of what he calls modern colonialism. First, that it did not constitute a simple relationship between master and servant, but rather one in which an entire society was robbed of its historical line of development, externally manipulated and transformed according to the needs and the interests of those who came from the outside. Second, that colonial rulers were unwilling to make any cultural concessions or to assimilate attributes of the subject population. Last, of course, was that modern colonialism was not only a relationship that could be described in structural terms, but one that had to be also understood in terms of intentions. Indeed, he suggested that colonization can take place without the building of a colony. He also pointed out to the idea of colony building that does not follow colonization, but instead originates in military conquest. So what is a colony? And I think this is very important again for us to consider. The colony is a new political organization created by invasion, conquest, sometimes settlement, but built on pre-colonial conditions. Its alien rulers are in sustained dependence on a geographically remote mother country. They come from England or they come from France, so on and so forth, or an imperial center, which claims exclusive right of possession of the colony. So, you know, Columbus can discover America, but in the end, it's actually not Columbus's, it's Spain. And hence, you know, much of Latin America speaks Spanish today. There are three major types of colonies that arose, if you will, in the 2 centuries of great colonialism in the 18th and 19th century as a result of the expansion of European, American, and even sometimes Asian powers, like the Japanese or the Chinese. The first type is what can be called exploitation colonies, which were usually the result of military conquest after the extended phase of contact without land claims. So the issue of land was not really important here. Their purpose was economic exploitation by means of trade, monopoly, use of natural resources, and levying tribute rather than farming. So for example, the Spanish and Portuguese colonies in Latin America and the French colonies in Indochina, in what became Vietnam, so on and so forth, were very much this particular type. Then there were maritime enclaves, which were the second type of colony, if you will. Their purpose was to foster indirect commercial penetration of a hinterland and to contribute to the logistics of maritime military deployment and informal control over formerly autonomous states. Of course, examples of this may be found all over the world, including even here in India. But the most famous examples were like Malacca, Portuguese Malacca in the Dutch Indonesia today, or even Aden in what is today South Yemen, or Hong Kong, or Singapore. And of course, the third type is what we call the settlement colony. This resulted from a military-supported process whose purpose was to utilize cheap labor and to provide an outlet for forms of social, religious, and cultural life that were basically under the control of the mother country, whether it's England or France or Germany. This type of colonial presence often took the form of permanent resident farmers, as in the case of North America and Australia specifically. Now, Benedict Anderson, in an important book, which is actually called Imagined Communities, and it's a very important book for those of you who are interested in the idea of the nation state and how it impacts planning, argues that beneath the colonial state, its ideological and policy exists a grammar. A part of this grammar are two institutions of power that are important to us, I would argue, as planners: the census and the map. Gathering information about a community that lives somewhere, and the map, basically the idea of mapping down or putting a geometry to what you have, what you control. Though invented before the mid-19th century, their form and function changed, of course, as colonized zones entered the age of mechanical reproduction. And I'll talk about that a bit later. These institutions, the census and the map, and their institutions, profoundly shaped the way in which the colonial state imagined its domination, the nature of the human beings it ruled, the geography of its domain, and even the legitimacy of its own ancestry. Anderson traces the origin of the census to the initial colonial encounter. And he says no one was really keeping track of the census, and even earlier censuses that occurred in the Middle Ages or the ones that occurred in the ancient empires of Rome or what have you were very different in nature. They were about resources. They were not necessarily about the counting of people. The colonialists who entered these countries saw class and race structures where they did not necessarily exist. Nevertheless, such grids of intelligibility translated into classificatory methods and means of governing. He concluded that census categories over the colonies become more visibly and exclusively racial over time, while religious identity gradually receded as a primary consensus classification. Census taking soon then found its spatial corollary, if you will, in the map, which allowed colonial states to multiply in size and function, to organize the welfare of the population, and in effect to govern. The map, like the census, made totalizing classifications possible. Thus, a map was a model for rather than a model of, and that's important. The map was a model for rather than a model of what it purported to represent. And now this is really important, because when you think about it, in very specific, a very, very good example here is what happens in Cyprus, one of the last colonized places by the British Empire. They still have a few until today, like Gibraltar, but you know, Cyprus actually got its independence in the 60s, so way after most of these other countries did. And 10 years before Cyprus, which is this little island in the Mediterranean, got its independence, Cyprus as a place for hundreds of years had existed with a population whose origin is Greek and predominantly Christian, and Muslim, whose origin is the Ottoman Empire, Turkey. But it was under the Ottoman Empire for a good 400 years. And then when it became independent only because of the fact that the British colonized it during World War I and continued to colonize it until World War II. Before the British decided to leave, and as a way of basically being able to resist the independence movement that was going on in Cyprus, what did they do? They decided, okay, there's a small minority of Muslims. It was not the majority of Cyprus, and it was not a small, it was a substantial minority. So they decided that the only police force that they would hire would come from the Turkish Cypriots. At a time when the Turkish Cypriots were also part of the resistance against the British, but they were the smaller group that was part of that resistance. And as a result of that, in fact, today Cyprus is a divided country, because from that point on, the Turkish Cypriots were assumed to be the collaborators with the colonizers, while the Greek Cypriots were then looked upon as those who actually resisted colonization. So 50 years or so after the conflict started, 70 years after independence, Cyprus today remains a divided country, partly because of what the British actually did to use one group against the other. I need not tell you about what the British did here in India. I'm sure you're more familiar with it than I am. In my own work, I did a book actually called Forms of Dominance some years ago, almost now 25 years ago or more. I speak more of dominance than I speak of colonialism, because I think actually the term is much more appropriate, if you will, in the context of planning. Dominance is not exclusive to colonial cities, but the use and manifestation of dominance in the colonial context is particularly blunt. Colonial cities, more than others, serve as an expression of dominance, and the study of colonialism allows for a very clear understanding of dominance intellectually, physically, symbolically, economically, so on and so forth. And because of that, colonial cities are important for us as planners to understand, because they are so different, because the politics of planning decisions in them are much more transparent. In colonial cities, the relationship between the dominator and the dominated were clear, where the political agendas and the motives behind them also become clear. So, but I want to complicate this equation. Of course, I actually leave this. This is a statue. It's a work of public art that many of you may be familiar with. It exists in Delhi. It's almost like, you know, the Western you know, settler coming in, representing, in this case, the governor of India, literally subjugating the Buddha, which I think is very indicative of how the colonial mentality, in a sense, worked. But I want to complicate this issue of colonialism, because sometimes we don't necessarily think about it. So what constitutes colonial planning model? For example, some scholars have argued that the Arab conquest of the Fertile Crescent in North Africa may not qualify as colonialism, since it was not immediately motivated by financial gain or organized capitalist expansion. There is definitely some justification for this view if one considers the colonizer-colonized relationship only in terms of the extraction of resources and labor. I argue otherwise, that using the case of the Fertile Crescent, I've actually made the exact opposite argument elsewhere, stressing that colonial nature of the expanding Islamic empire cannot be dismissed. The Arab conquest of the Central and Middle East was primarily motivated by three colonial elements: the ideological nature of the Islamic religion, which assigned Arabs the duty of fulfilling, at that time, what they considered to be a divinely ordained mission to spread the word of Allah. Two, the desire of the ruling Arab elite to maintain their political power while expanding their trade activities, possibly even at the expense of those that they occupied. And the economic necessity of appropriating lands and resources from wealthier, but at that time, militarily weaker nations. Often the Arab takeover of a city did not involve, if you will, confrontation. So, if I were to, for example, look at a city like Damascus, and actually you're looking at Damascus is a beautiful city that has been unfortunately devastated in the past 10 years because of its current civil war. The case of Damascus is very interesting. The native population did not, for example, resist the Arab conquest that occurred in the 7th and 8th century, because they actually felt ethnically closer to them as southern neighbors, as opposed to their Byzantine lords who had ruled them from the north and who also spoke a different language. So if you're colonized by one group and then another group comes to colonize you, but that other group that comes to colonize you happens to share the same ethnicity, is that any better? Yet it is precisely because of this racial or ethnic closeness that most scholars of the Arab and Islamic civilization have not adequately considered this early relationship of Arab-Muslim urbanism as colonial. I have. In other ways, the evidence of a colonial relationship, in my opinion, was actually much more evident. For example, appropriating and dismantling the religious and political buildings of earlier civilizations becomes a very common practice of all colonizing people, including in this case the Arabs. And the symbolism associated with such transformation cannot be considered anything, I would argue, but colonial. The takeover of churches and the transformation into mosques and the construction of palaces for the new rulers at the center of a new town or an existing town both represented colonial urbanism at work. I'm actually showing you this here because this is the famous Umayyad mosque in Damascus, that I just showed you. It's in the middle of the city. It's in actually pristine shape, compared to others. This is a mosque that is literally 1,300 years old. But inside of the mosque is the church of St. John the Baptist. In fact, this used to be the only church that existed on site. But as the mosque expanded and expanded and expanded, the church ended up being this little structure inside the mosque, leaving, for me at least, this very symbolic trace to remind me of who was there before. Even though the Arabs did not necessarily separate themselves residentially from the people that they occupied, they also did engage in colonial-like behavior that ultimately transformed the urban fabric of a city like Damascus. Now, if I were to move from this to something like Haussmannization that I just talked about in my lecture this morning, as we move toward the colonial experience in the 19th century and the early 20th century, the discussion of colonial urbanism must inevitably confront the issue of modernity, with both its material and conceptual dimensions. According to Anthony Giddens, for example, modernity refers to those modes of social life or organization which emerged in Europe from about the 18th century onwards and which subsequently became more or less worldwide in their influence. Colonialism was the vehicle by which urban planning and modernization was exported to many non-Western societies. So in a sense, we have to see Baron Haussmann's work in Paris as part of that specific lineage. There are three ways in which I mean this idea of modern planning was impacted by this. First, it was modernist in that it saw modernization as progressive, as liberatory. Thus, modern planning was meant to produce a great deal more than simply a built environment. It was meant also to create societies and nations. To organize a new country is essentially to invent the future of that country. In fact, this is a statement that I just read to you right now, came from Marshal Lyautey, who was one of the governors of Morocco for a good 20 years, the French governor of Morocco when it was colonized. Second, and I'm making that connection between the two, it was modern planning, in this case, the idea of modern planning as colonial, it was modern in that it involved a whole professional apparatus, planners, architects, designers, anthropologists, social scientists, orientalists, all involved in the process of rationalizing the colonies, figuring out what is traditional and what should be preserved, what should be modernized and how. And this was primarily, if you will, a first world apparatus with professionals either directly from the first world or at least trained in the first world, even when those countries became independent. This is what Berman has actually called, Berman, that I just talked about extensively in my lecture this morning, borrowed modernism. We see similar apparatus emerging also in post-World War II, in which colonialism here as political plays a role. Third, colonialism meant establishing not only an economic and military relationship between diverse societies, the dominant and the dominated, it also meant somehow negotiating and reconfiguring difference. This is where someone like Rabineau, whom I again used in my first lecture when I talked about how do you write the history of planning, that what Lyautey, this Marshal Lyautey, was doing in Morocco was to try to invent a social technology to orchestrate control of this diversity, the diversity of the population that is being controlled. Colonialism then was above all an ideology of racial difference. One cannot ignore that. So in addition to the military and economic violence that was enacted by colonialism, there is also this symbolic violence, a violence that Edward Said, if you will, called Orientalism, an epistemic violence affected by the technologies of knowledge, if you will. To understand the colonies, we have to understand what was happening in Paris at that time. Remember, again, that's why these two lectures are very much tied to each other. The Haussmannization, the reshaping of Paris through this major urban planning project, the design project that was actually started in 1848 and after the great barricades of the Paris Commune. This was what was also being implemented. So in the early 1830s, the French established a military stronghold in Algeria. And by the 1840s, the French military also came to be in charge of urban planning in the entire country. In Algeria, from 1830 to 1855, there was tremendous demolition of traditional cities, just complete demolition of the cities. I'll show you a few examples. So actually we're seeing this as we're still seeing parts of Paris here. And again, all of these are elements of what we will see later then in Algiers. Hospitals or churches, palaces, in this very specific context, built for colonial rulers, become part of the way you actually control this very specific society. In 1865, things actually began to change. Two new imperatives emerged in Algeria. There has been tremendous destruction of these monuments, and travelers, French travelers, who were now almost visiting the colonized lands, and saw it as exotic, started to lament this loss. Oh my God, look at this beautiful stuff that is, there from older times. Why should we just not preserve it altogether? So there was this interest in sort of preserving what was there. And many of the travelers were actually also disappointed to find that what started to emerge in Algiers, and I showed you several images of Algiers already, what was starting to emerge in Algiers was like just a bad copy of what had already existed in Paris. So disillusionment, if you will, among the French romantics and the disappearance of the so-called the charming exotic Orient with its labyrinthian and picturesque streets resulted finally in questioning the policy that the French had put in place. So what is that policy? It was a policy that they called assimilation. What was the idea behind it? The idea behind it was that we are engaged in a mission to civilize those people. If we have to civilize those people, one of the things we have to do is we have to cleanse them from their old culture. What is their old culture? Arabic as a language, Islam as a religion, which was very difficult to do, the way they move in the streets, the clothes that they wear, so on and so forth. So we have to make them like us. So even though we are the foreigners, we will assimilate them into us. So assimilation was the initial policy that existed, if you will, for a very long time in Algiers in the middle of the 19th century. The French government, in fact, as they became much more interested in encouraging tourism through official preservation policy, then started to focus on, well, maybe it's good to preserve some aspect of that exotic native, because that exotic native will always be different from us, and at the same time, we will still try to civilize them, but we want to make sure that we get French people to visit over there as well. In 1865, the heavy-handed tactics gave way to another policy altogether, when that assimilation did not work, which they called association, or association. In it, the notion was different, that, look, we want those people to exist, we cannot completely change them, we will associate with them, which in this case meant, for the first time, we will build for ourselves our own towns, what the British then later actually talked about as their own white towns, because the black town was there. And this is not necessarily terminology that emerged in Africa, even though it existed more so in Africa by the British. But even the notion of the white town and the black town did not necessarily refer to white people and black people, although that may be the case in some cases. It referred simply to the place of the Europeans and the place of the natives. Association, in a sense, was an acceptance of a realistic condition. Not only were the demolitions, for example, in the Kasbah of Algiers, which was the traditional quarter of Algiers, halted, but also there was a tremendous attempt to preserve, if you will, what was there. Now, this is a very interesting time. So again, what was being demolished was what you see on the right, what was being built, what you see on the left. And the best critic for that, of course, is the major philosopher who was, again, part of, subject of the French colonial structure at the time, Frantz Fanon, who writes this book in 1961 called The Wretched of the Earth, a beautiful book that, in my opinion, all planners should actually read. And it is one that, in a sense, goes to the heart of what colonialism is as a planning exercise. Thus emerges the idea of the dual colonial city. Fanon, in lamenting the poverty and the deprivation of the colonized people in the colonial city, in the part of the colonial city, writes passionately about this dual city. He says the following: the zone where the natives live is not complementary to the zone inhabited by the settlers. The two zones are opposed, but not in the service of a higher unity. Obedient to the ruler of Aristotelian logic, they both follow the principle of reciprocal exclusivity. No conciliation is possible. For one of the two terms, one is superfluous. The settler's town is strongly built town, all made of stone and steel. It is brightly lit, the streets are covered with asphalt, and the garbage can swallow all the leaving, unseen, unknown, and hardly throughout. The settler's feet are never visible, except perhaps in the sea, and they are never close enough to see them. His feet are protected by the strong shoes, although the streets of his town are clean and even no holes and stones. The settler's town is a well-fed town, an easy-going town. Its belly is always full of good things. The settler's town is a town of white people, of foreigners. The town belonging to the colonized people, or at least the native town, the Negro village, the Medina, the reservation, is a place of ill fame, peopled by men of evil repute. They are born there. It matters little where or how they die there. It matters not where nor how. It is a world without spaciousness. Men live there on top of one another. The native town is a hungry town, starved of bread, of meat, of shoes, of coal, even of light. The native town is a crouching village, a town on its knees, a town wallowing in its mire. Now, this is very important because then when we look at the kind of plans that architects and planners then came up with, particularly in the 20th century, for precisely this same town, Algiers. So, in a sense, this sense of the colonies being a testing ground of new ideas, of providing the opportunity for the implementation of plans that could not possibly be implemented even in France itself, is much more evident in the work of Corbusier, one of the famous architects, I would even argue the most famous architect of the 20th century, and his problematic relationship with Algiers specifically. Corbusier, in fact, before he becomes famous, visits Morocco and visits what is today Algeria and visits Turkey and writes this book, Le Voyage de l'Orient, A Voyage to the Orient. He is completely fascinated by what he sees, whether it's in Morocco, or Algeria, or Turkey. He sees this as one single world, the world of the Muslims. For him, it didn't really matter anything else, even though he was a highly educated man and extremely informed and actually even culturally sensitive. As you know, he plays a role here close by in India, in Chandigarh. But for him, because the world is divided into two groups, he takes that for granted, just like the colonized people took it for granted. So Corbu comes to Algiers and he is mesmerized by its vernacular architecture. In fact, his cubism emerged, if you look at it historically, emerged from his appreciation of the architecture of the other. In this case, the vernacular architecture that he saw in places like Algiers and Turkey. The other thing that also happens is he exists in France. He's actually Swiss, but he's practicing in Europe. Europe by that time, particularly after the war, is rebuilding. They are very conscious of building codes. They are very conscious of land use regulations. There are all of these things that for him are preventing him from doing what he wants. So he's frustrated and he senses that, oh my God, there's this amazing opportunity in places like Algiers. So he goes to Algiers. And in fact, even his notion of what is it that he's going to be able to do in Algiers is very simple, because for him, ideas flow down from Paris, the center of modernity, if you will, to white Africa, which is North Africa, if you will, where Algiers is, and then to the rest of black Africa, all of which are French, possessions. Corbu's plan for Algiers was a reflection of this unequal exchange of the colonial relationship. Ironically, this is the very axis, of course, in which a very different kind of exchange of resources was also happening. We should never forget that. Why? Because this is where material resources were taken from Africa all the way up to Paris, if you will. So while ideas were flowing from north to south, resources extracted from Africa were flowing from south to north. Resources and actually labor, if you will. But Corbu's particular interest in Algiers manifests itself in some of the plans he did. He first visited the city in the early 1930s during the festivities that were, believe it or not, marking 100 years of French occupation of Algiers. And he had actually thought that the city was perhaps, and I'm using his own words here, translated from French, the most beautiful city in the world. Here was an appropriate slate for his vision. These visions were embodied in his plan for Algiers, which he actually called Plan Obus. So let's look at this Plan Obus. The idea of Plan Obus was very simple: to link a modern business district with the European residential districts while preserving the Kasbah intact. What does that mean? You have an old city. Now, the colonialists wanted to have their own town, so they built this white town outside. Yet, they are far away from the water. And now the business district, which is the area that they demolished and built quite a lot of the commercial activity that has become the central business district, is way out there. So, what to do? Well, you build a huge bridge that connects the white town to this big tower, which is very much like the United Nations that he later builds in New York, if you will. And you just have the city underneath. The rest of the city is left there. His imagination of it was very simple, that the power of that imaginary was that basically what you have is the key elements of the plan were an elevated highway that would act as the link, hovering over the city, skyscrapers in the business district, similar, in fact, to, as I said, to what Corbu has done elsewhere in the United States, as well as even in Europe. These would also act, which was very interesting, as housing for the workers. It contained, in this case, residential cells for the workers, a poignant image of a colonial infrastructure, literally supported on the backs of native labor. And from their cells, Algerian workers would have looked out on a sea they would not really control towards a distant land where the beneficiaries of their labor actually existed. And so there was, this colonial vision epitomized, a Kasbah that is preserved as a historic document, quarantined from the business district and the European life. For Corbusier, that separation, this duality, captured the essence of colonialism, the sense that the Muslims in this case were different and not necessarily ought to be integrated. Corbu imagined the Algerian Kasbah as beautiful because it reminded him of the and I'm actually using his exact words here as translated from French, the supple-hipped and fully breasted Algerian woman, end quote. Here, then, we have the very clearly gendered and sexualized terms of modern planning. The city literally as a feminized object. And I think even this sketch, which is very interesting, where how is the Kasbah represented? She's represented as this woman who's sort of wearing a veil, and the only thing that you have is what she can see from. Ironically, this does not really exist exactly in Algeria. Algerian women were not like that. It's women of Central Asia who wore this kind of a garb. But, for Corbu, they were all the same. It didn't really matter much. Corbu's Plan Obus, in this case, and again, that's another sketch that Corbu has actually made. Corbu's Plan Obus was never really implemented because even colonial officials thought the plan was too sweeping, almost something that required fundamental bombardment of Algiers, even though it was supposed to preserve it. What I want to remind you of here is that, from this Algerian encounter, Corbu's ideas of modern planning were defined in a relationship to what he thought was the traditional city. He was trying to articulate a universal planning aesthetic. This is the core of high modernism. But this universalism was defined also through difference, through the preservation of the native of the Kasbah. It is an articulation then of an essential difference. This is what Rabineau, the guy that I told you about earlier, who has studied French colonialism, calls techno-cosmopolitanism, a beautiful term which, in a sense, for him was the application of modern technologies and modernist ideas as a form of control and dominance under very specific local circumstances. Now, the combination of modernization and preservation found its clearest expression in Morocco. I'm still actually showing you a map of Brazil here, of Algiers here. Morocco was, in fact, the latest of the French colonies because it was only occupied in 1912. So it resisted French colonization for a very long time. But its main architect or planner was Marshal Lyautey, who saw North Africa as an excellent testing ground for creating new energy, the rejuvenation, if you will, of the idea of planning. Here, the city of tomorrow could be built. Here, the future could be invented. Lyautey then got very famous French architects and planners like Corbusier and like Henri Prost to Morocco to draw up master plans for the two cities, Rabat and Casablanca. Remember, Paris was the model. Paris had already happened, Paris had already been planned, Paris had become very successful. So in Casablanca, Proust, one of the architects of the time, set out to implement Baron Haussmann's vision. As in Paris, the boulevards became crucial as a circulation network and a grid for zoning. Now, as I actually criticize some of these activities and some of these procedures that can definitely be considered only planning procedures, I think it is very important for all of us to remember also that some of these cities today, while they maintain that form, or possibly because they maintain that form, are very successful cities. So Casablanca is a beautiful, beautiful city. But it's a beautiful city that was achieved at a particular expense at that given moment in time. One extremely important component of planning is one has to think of who pays the price. Who, in a sense, ultimately pays the price. Whether it is legitimate to deprive a generation, as actually happened in the context of China as a country, or two, of certain rights, of certain capacities, or of even basic citizenship, so that another generation could, in fact, enjoy what they would do. So in Casablanca, what had actually happened with Proust was the establishment of zoning and building codes that were to create a particular set of street facades. Along them, the boulevards would emerge. Now, Proust and then later Lyautey could implement these sweeping changes because they were operating in a colonial context where there was no democracy, there is no parliament, there is nobody who would actually question what they would do. That Haussmannization was, in fact, literally able to be pursued. It was possible for it to be able to be pursued because of what happened earlier in France, in a sense, 60 or 70 years earlier with the Haussmannization of the city itself, of Paris itself. But in the colonies like Morocco, French architects and planners had this unchecked freedom. They had complete control over rights. So, for example, issues of public domain did not exist. All you needed to do was you would settle the native people without necessarily even asking their opinion and without necessarily giving them compensation, because you had that capacity, you had that authority. So, now actually I'm going to go back to this slide because I think it is still irrelevant. On a visit to Morocco in 1930, a Parisian critic was enraptured by what he actually saw, admiring the beautifully preserved Medinas and the old Arab town and the stunning new French cities that were also built along them for the French settlers. He realized that important social considerations underlay their artistic effect. He actually writes, "This is a laboratory of Western life and the conservatory of Oriental life simultaneously." Very interesting. This is a laboratory of Western life. So we're bringing something different to these people, but at the same time, we're really very sensitive and we're also conserving for them what they have. Proust, under Lyautey's direction, came up with the master plan that left the old city or the Kasbah almost intact and built the European city or settlements around them. Lyautey actually writes, touch the indigenous cities as little as possible. Instead, improve their surrounding, where on the vast terrain that is still free, the European city rises, following a plan which realizes the most modern conceptions of large boulevards, water and electrical supplies, squares and gardens, and also a foreseeing of future expansion. This, in fact, meant the unlimited expansion of the European quarters, which is something that we actually see in a place like Casablanca today. The construction of new European quarters surrounding the Kasbah were facilitated by the freeing up of the outlying military land, which was no longer now needed because you had colonialism. And thus emerged the dual city of colonialism. Excessive expenditure on the modern or western section of the city, while the rural, crowded, old, decaying indigenous city was basically left almost to be musified and to become the traditional city. Another way in which associationism, remember, by the time the French get to a place like Morocco, they are no longer engaged in this assimilation. They gave it up. You leave these indigenous people on their own. So in Morocco, they pursued a very different strategy than they did in Algeria. Was associationism, and through it, if you will, a different idea emerged. And it's a very interesting idea. It was actually called Arabescence. Arabescence coming from Arab. The notion here was we can actually even use, for us, the Westerners, who live in the western part of town, some stylistic elements of Arab architecture. In fact, in this case, of Moorish architecture, which was not necessarily the architecture of Morocco, but was the architecture of the nearby Iberian Peninsula in Andalusia. In a sense, this was an attempt to create beneath this facade of nativity, as if in fact you are part of the native population, a totally different form of political structure. Now, one of the architects of that new Medina was a guy called Laprade. And for him, Laprade engaged in this notion of creating an architecture that spoke as much to the native people as it did, if you will, to the colonized people. This is when the idea of the hybrid starts to occur as a planning model. There, in the words of the French Minister of the Colonies, back in one of these exhibits that was actually made in 1945, is a space that is free and cities that can be constructed according to the principles of reason and beauty, contrary to the principles of chaos and disorganization that had reigned before. As if, of course, the Arabs or the Muslims for the 1300 years that had occurred before were planning according to chaos, as if chaos was, in fact, the frame of reference. But this ideology of space, which was now being imported, which also was based on, or was principally an ideology that is based on difference, played out not simply in the colonies, but also in the colonizing countries themselves, as Tim Mitchell showed in his brilliant work. So I'm actually going to show a piece of that just as a way of showing, again, we're completely still in Morocco here. And this is some of the architecture that exists within this very specific area. Tim Mitchell writes this book called Colonizing Egypt. He's a political scientist who is very much interested also in the history of planning. He's writing, about what happens when Egyptian visitors visit one of these universal expositions. And in fact, let me see if I can get that particular image. Yeah, that's Exposition Universelle. So, one of these expositions, just like the Crystal Palace, is now happening in France, but it's actually happening in 1889. And there are different countries that have their pavilions. But you have to remember that the expositions were principally, at that time, particularly the 19th century, made by countries that were empires, and they were showcasing to their people, not other countries, although China may have been there, but they were mainly showing their own colonies. So there had to be a Moroccan exhibit in this particular exhibition, or an Egyptian exhibition. So in this case, we have an Egyptian exhibition that is happening in the 1890 World Exposition in Paris. Egyptians are visiting, they travel too. So they visit the city and they visit their own exposition. They're shocked. They actually find that their own exposition is like a street that is taken from Cairo and completely reconstructed in the exposition in Paris. Okay, this is interesting, so what? This is not a problem at all. But then they encounter something very interesting. They find one of these structures which has a minaret, and it's a mosque. And it's identical to a mosque in Cairo. So they take off their shoes and they go in, only to discover that it is a bar in which, in fact, there are belly dancers. So they're like shocked. And in a sense, this puts them in a position where they don't necessarily understand what that is. So of course, not only do they get offended, but also they sort of recognize that their own presence is simply reduced to an image, and there's absolutely no content to anything at all beyond that. What is extremely interesting also about that particular exhibition of 1889 is that the ruler of Egypt at the time, one of the Khedives, goes there, and there is a mansion that was also built in the exposition that resembles his mansion. And he decides, because it resembles his mansion, he's going to stay in the mansion. But that's very ironic, because he becomes an object of the exhibition as well, even though he is supposedly the ruler of an independent country that now has diplomatic relations with France. So even things of that sort, colonialism has this power that reduces the colonized into simply being an object of the colonial. And in a sense, those are again some additional elements of how this particular street, in fact, what was really spent on building this particular exhibition is really amazing, because, and this is very ironic, but it fits to, for us also as architects and planners, because the French were very meticulous. So what did they do? They went and surveyed a particular street in Cairo, which had never been surveyed before. Every inch of it was surveyed. They drew plans and elevations and sections of every single building, and they took all of these things and they replicated them. In one case, as they were doing so, they actually then discovered that, oh, it's very interesting, this particular building that we are putting in the exhibition resembles a building, or it's a copy of a building that is in very poor shape in Cairo. The only thing that survives from that building are the metal grills that exist on the windows. So of course they convinced the Egyptian authorities to pull the metal grills out of the original building and to put them in the copy that exists in the Paris exposition. 100 years later, when the Egyptians, when a German archaeological mission was trying to preserve that same structure in Cairo, they had no plans whatsoever to do so. They didn't even know what it looked like. So they went to the archives of the Paris exposition and they looked at what was there, and they used the image of what exists in the Paris exposition to preserve and conserve and partly rebuild the structure in Egypt. The copy, in a sense, became the frame of reference by which the original could be restored or even maintain its existence. What does that really tell us? It's a very complex story. But here, again, I want to go back to the Crystal Palace. The Crystal Palace was, which I talked about earlier, its actual title was actually called The Great Exhibition of the Work of Industry of All Nations, when the British put it together. All foreign manufacturers and nations were in fact invited to this exhibition, and the idea was to promote unrestricted international trade on part of British industrialists. Exactly like, you know, the World Trade Organization today and all of the kind of agreements that Donald Trump wants to change around the world. What Mitchell talks about in his book Colonizing Egypt is what was on exhibit was in fact the conversion of the world into a modernist capitalist production and exchange, and to the movement of communication and the processes of inspection on which all of these changes were supposed to depend. So for this exhibition of 1889, it was very important. I mean, you have to remember, the Eiffel Tower was the entrance to that exhibition. When you enter the exhibition, you pass through the Eiffel Tower. And the Eiffel Tower is also very interesting, a very controversial building, because everybody celebrated it when it was built as the entrance to the exhibition. But after 10 years, when the exhibition was down, Parisians were so ashamed of the Eiffel Tower that they wanted to demolish it. And then the cost of demolishing it was so big that they didn't know what to do. So they sponsored the competition to cover it up. And architects submitted designs to cover it up with stone and to cover it up with bricks and what have you. And there was no money to do it. Today, the Eiffel Tower, which was the thing that was considered to be this sort of a blatant, bad thing, has become the most iconic thing that defines Paris itself. In 1867, Ali Mubarak, who was an accomplished Egyptian administrator, traveled to Paris and actually studied with Baron Osman. And as he studied with Baron Osman and he sort of saw the kind of changes that were occurring in the city, he went back to Egypt and implemented in Cairo exactly what happened in Paris 30 years earlier. So he did that in the 1880s and 1890s, replicating what happened in Paris in the 1850s and 1860s. The disorder of Cairo at the time, and so this is Ali Mubarak, and that was the Cairo of his time. Mubarak was in fact a westernizer. He finally got a chance when he had a Khedive, a ruler, who was very much like Napoleon II, who would later declare, very interestingly, and this is the ruler of Egypt, like the king of Egypt, "My country is no longer part of Africa. We are now part of Europe." Just a declaration like that, very easily. My country is no longer part of Africa. Geography doesn't matter here. In 1863, Mubarak was no doubt, in this case, the chief planner and the chief architect of the transformation that occurred in Cairo. And between 1868 and 1972, Ismail actually commissioned him to draw up a master plan that fundamentally changed the city, in which 900 dwelling units, 27 mosques, 18 bathhouses, 27 shops were totally demolished, so as to be able to cut through some of the streets, one of which you actually see here in this particular slide. Again, this was just the example that I was telling you, that when Ismail actually went to the exposition later, he actually stayed in this house, and he was very proud of it, despite the fact that he himself was now being put on display. What is really important to recognize here is that none of these things really occur outside the context of global trade and global exchange. And this is how I'm going to end this lecture. If you recall, one of you asked me, I think yesterday or the day before, about some of the changes that occur as a result of the World Bank or USAID putting particular conditions to certain countries. And I talked about how is it that to be able to build the Aswan High Dam so as to prevent the flooding that completely destroyed the Egyptian economy, Nasser had to nationalize the Suez Canal. Well, the Suez Canal itself has another story. It's a story that has to do with the fact that people throughout history, since the time of the ancient Egyptians, have always thought of connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and cutting the trade routes so that instead of having to go all around Africa and the Horn of Africa to connect India, mainly to connect India, China to some extent, all the way to Europe, you can just simply actually have half the distance. Exactly, you simplify it to even about 42% of the entire distance by going through the Suez Canal. To build the Suez Canal, Ismail, same guy who commissioned Ali Mubarak to redesign Cairo, needed expertise, needed money. His country was not colonized. In fact, he was actually independent, partly. Where is the money going to come from? Oh, it's going to come from French banks and English banks. Okay, then they decided that if the money is going to come from French banks and English banks, then the least that we ought to do is we ought to get some collateral. You have to get some collateral. We want to make sure that you're going to pay us back. So what Ismail did And again, this again has to do with global trade. I want you to completely understand that. The Civil War is happening in the United States, the country that produces the largest amount of cotton in the world. Suddenly, cotton production of the United States, because of the war, has collapsed. But cotton production was introduced to Egypt at the beginning of the 19th century. So that country suddenly becomes the country that is producing the largest cotton in the world. English mills that occurred in the Industrial Revolution in Liverpool and Manchester that I just talked about need cotton to produce textile. Get it from Egypt. So Ismail sold the future crop of cotton for 10 years to the British and to the French. And to his bad luck, the Nile was low. So he could not provide enough cotton, and the Suez Canal was being built. He got into debt. Ultimately, in a sense, he had to give up his share in the Suez Canal because he could not provide cotton. So even though he wanted the Suez Canal, he didn't get the Suez Canal. The French and the British got it. And suddenly, there was this part of the country, which again is part of how colonialism works, that was ultimately surrendered to the British and the French. And when the Egyptians actually objected, ultimately the British came and occupied Egypt in 1882. So I say this story because I think it is very important to recognize how these connections, in a sense, actually work. And what is it that even something like the practice of physical planning is part of a much wider strategy that is going on in terms of global interaction altogether. And actually, this is my lecture for this part, and I think I'm completely on time, if I'm right. And we can put the lights on, and I think we have time for questions or no? Okay, very good. We'll break for lunch and we'll take questions.
So we leave and then or 2:15.
2:15 so that we can come back on time.